was it a slide after this, or were we right here? So, yeah.
We had like 2 minutes left.
Oh, yeah, we were talking about the weird sisters.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting on the king's good side. We talked about Agnes Thompson, right?
Yeah.
Why? Let's just do this. Hey. Okay. So Agnes Thompson, and then whether or not we're really getting back on the king's good side. So the king's interest in witchcraft is well known, right? I've already mentioned this book he published on demonology, and its goal or its content is insight on how evil threatened his divine rule. We did talk about the weird sisters, right, being like the fates.
Yeah, I think that was the last thing we talked about.
I think that was too. So, there's a little more, like, there's a few interesting things that have happened to King James, which might help explain his interest in witchcraft. So when he was visiting Oxford in 1605, he's greeted by 3 witches on the road, and they hail him as a descendant of Banquo. Now keep that name in mind because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Okay? So there are these 3 weird sisters. We talked about yesterday 3 a.m. being witching hour. So 3 actually comes to figure a lot in this. So there's 3 witches. Guess how many times they appear? 3 times. 3. Mm-hmm. Except for Thomas Middleton, like, threw in a chunk. And we don't read that one because it's not Shakespeare, right? So they often speak in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So they take turns. So it's continuously compounding these 3s. Okay, so Shakespeare's playing with a lot of that kind of stuff. It says he's the descendant of Banquo. I think I've moved some slides around last year, and I think that part is missing. So Banquo is, in the real Macbeth, Macbeth's BFF, right? It's his best friend, and he helped Macbeth. He was on Macbeth's side. And it turns out, like, King James is actually supposed to be related to him, according to Holinshed's Chronicles. So Shakespeare uses that, too. All right. Macbeth's audiences, what would they have thought about witches at the time? Bad, but they definitely thought about them. Okay? So here's another rendition. So remember, this is like Elizabethan Renaissance time, so there's lots of art. Can you tell, it's like, take a look at these witches. Is there anything you notice?
They look like dudes.
kind of look like dudes. I'm not sure.
I think that's part of the hood.
I think it's just the hood of the other side. Yeah. They're kind of interesting. So Shakespeare plays with that too, guys. All right. Anyway, so remember that a person is very much a product of their time. So there does seem to be a lot of witchcraft. We've got King James being like having people say that he's the enemy of the devil. We've got somebody who actually tried to like prevent him from being king. Did I tell you that one yet? Okay.
Yeah, but you didn't tell us why.
Okay. Let's see.
Oh, wait. That was the girl who said that.
So, no, this is a different one. There's a story that in 1590, a group of witches tried to kill James before he was king. The plot was discovered and they're brought to trial. One of those witches, Agnes Thompson, claimed that she had collected toad venom to poison the king, christened a cat, tied parts of a dead man's body to it, we don't know which parts, sailed out to sea in a sieve, and had thrown the cat, body bits and all, overboard in order to raise a storm that would sink James's ship. That's quite an elaborate scheme, isn't it? Okay, also, besides the fact that we're, some kind of concoction, do you guys know what a sieve is?
No.
You guys know what a colander is? A strainer? Okay, that's what she's sailing in. That's what she says. She's sailing in something that is full of holes. So this is supposed to give you an idea of their power, suggesting that she can sail in something that doesn't hold, won't actually float on its own. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a little bit more to that, but I'll kind of come back to it in a second. So we have these witches. And actually, witch mania was kind of what's going on. Like, the Elizabethans were very much, like, enamored with this idea. Do you guys know what I forgot what I was gonna say. Totally left my mind. Morbid fascination. That's the word. Do you know what a morbid fascination is?
When you're fascinated by something a lot.
That's something but also something that's kind of dark or also creeps you out or like, yeah.
So like witches.
Yeah. So that's kind of what's going on. Most people believed in witches. Most of them did. It was a good way to explain bad things, right? Things that went wrong. If this happened, oh my gosh, they must have been cursed, right? So they definitely believed in witches. They're fascinated by them. The crime of witchcraft reached terrifying proportions between 1560 and 1603. Hundreds of people, nearly all of them were women, were convicted of being witches and executed. Okay, so King James here, being fascinated by witchcraft, wasn't really that abnormal. Okay, so he's as fascinated by it as his subjects. Okay, so you remember that story I just told you. King James personally interrogated one of the 3 accused witches that had tried to prevent him from being king. His name was Dr. Fian. He was a male. The doctor was tortured during the interrogation, and here's a direct quote that was recorded at that time. His nails upon all of his fingers were riven and pulled off. His legs were crushed and beaten together, as small as might be, and the bones and flesh so bruised that blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance. So I had a great time.
Put some dirt on it.
Please. So he's all fired up by this witchy experience, right? And this is around the time that he starts investigating other cases and then writes and publishes Demonology, this book on witchcraft. When he became King of England in 1603, he ordered its immediate printing in London, right? So he becomes king and is like, and here's my book for you all. Okay. Which they probably would have read because they had pamphlets that were circulating at the time that contained tales of witches, right? Do you guys remember, you guys have seen magazines like on the checkout stand, right? That have all kinds of like really headlines that are meant to attract. It probably would have been kind of like that, right? We call them like gossip rags. That's the old name for them. Yeah, so they definitely were reading about it. They were fascinated by it and probably saw it everywhere. So here's some of the things that Elizabethans and Renaissance people thought about witches. They believed that they had diabolical powers, that they could predict the future, that they could bring on night in the middle of the daytime, that they could cause fogs and tempests. Fog is associated with witches. Interesting, huh? Tempests, you guys know what tempests are? Nasty storms, like hurricane level kind of like really bad storms. Kill animals.
That's really normal.
Yeah, that's not too crazy. Curse enemies with fatal wasting diseases, so people that just seem to kind of waste away. Knowing what kind of conditions they lived in London, there's probably a whole lot of other reasons behind that. But still, so they're looking to explain what kinds of things are happening. Causing nightmares and sterility. Sterility is kind of a big deal because, well, you're not going to live that long anyway. Most of your kids will probably die. So if you can't produce something to, continue the population, sucks to be you. Thought they could take demonic possession of any individual, that they could raise evil spirits by concocting brews. Okay? It was also believed, and this actually goes back, I believe, even earlier, but they believed that the witches allowed the devil to suck their blood. Accused witches were examined for the devil's mark, which could be a red mark on their body from which the devil had sucked their blood. This could be anywhere. A lot of times it was probably a mole or a birthmark, something like that, but yeah. Kind of interesting.
So weird.
Mm-hmm. This was believed for like a long time though. The edger outside. All right. All right. So obviously, that does kind of beg the question, Was it like misogyny? Do you guys know? And in case you don't know what misogyny is, here's a definition for you: the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. Okay, so yes, it was mostly women between 1560 and 1603. Hundreds of people, nearly all of them women, were convicted as witches. Now, if we're going to be logical about it, it's most likely women who didn't like fit the norm, right? That didn't really want to get married, didn't really want to deal with people, would prefer to live like on the edge of society in a little cottage and be left alone, right? And you know how people tell stories, like people's imaginations get going, and pretty soon, why in the world would someone do something so obviously different from everyone else? There must be something going on, right? So they could get labeled as a witch. So yeah, it was usually single old women who kept cats that were in danger. It doesn't mean that there weren't a few others, but people were so fascinated by it. Like, I think they just kind of were looking for it everywhere. Okay, so there's an act of parliament in 1604 that decreed that anyone found guilty of practicing witchcraft would be executed. As if, like, the witch tests weren't enough. So if you were convicted, you're executed, and with the methods of information extraction used by interrogators, people were likely to spill their guts, literally. So.
No, the witch testings are stupid, because either way, the person who's being tested will die.
Well, yeah, and obviously if
there was no
it's like if you defy normal things, like you should float, like most people float, but if you sink, you must have been innocent, right? So those witches who confessed to being witches did so under torture or probably were in the grip of delusions. There might have been some actual ones. We have no idea. We have not a clue. Not a clue. We do know that there's a reason that torture is not used anymore, because people will say whatever in order, yeah. So, all right.
Not at all effective, because you get
False information. Yeah, people will tell you whatever you want to hear in order to make it stop. Okay. So if you want Shakespeare, if you want witches, you go to Shakespeare. Shakespeare has, he drew on everything that the Elizabethans believed and then added to it. And some of that stuff that he's added to it, people have taken and kind of run with. So this is, and you guys have heard of the Harry Potter movie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I would think so, but every now and then people look at me like, no, what are you talking about? It's all from Macbeth?
everything, or just
All of that.
line?
No, all of it. All of this. Like this whole song, all of the lyrics are from Macbeth. I don't think there's anything in this that's not. There you go. Kind of interesting. Also gave you a break from writing for a second. All right. So Shakespeare knows the witches have to be part of the play. They have to be involved. Whoops. Yeah. They have to be involved. However,
I have a question.
he can't make it contemporary. He can't make it modern. Yeah.
He is believing up or he is questioning?
I don't understand your question.
If Shakespeare believed the witches are true,
Uh huh.
or not?
We don't actually know. We don't know if he believed in them, but he knows that. Remember, he has to write a play for the king because his boys done messed up, right? So he's trying to create a play that is going to interest King James, and King James is interested in witches. Okay, so some of this is redundant. It's okay. So if you already have it, you don't have to write it. So he researches the Scottish history, right? Remember, King James is also the king of Scotland, yeah. So he's looking for a story that he can rework to reflect modern times because that's kind of his forte, right?
So at that time, were the two countries united, or did they still hate each other?
There's a lot of tension between them. It's
But were
more.
they considered the same?
Are they what?
Were they considered the same?
No,
Since they were both under the same rule?
No.
No.
They I believe they maintained
separate.
the separation, yeah. So, but Shakespeare likes to reflect stuff that's currently going on, but he has to be careful about it, right? He has to put it in a historical context in order to not get himself in trouble. So, of course, he goes to his favorite book, and he comes across a story of a Scottish king named Duncan who's killed by the traitor Macbeth. Okay, and he takes the throne for himself. And okay, so given the time period, so we're talking about around the same time that Beowulf is recorded, is written down, right? That's when the real Macbeth lived. So it is possible that Macbeth could have challenged the king. Like, he could have planned to challenge the king and then defeated him in combat and became king. I've seen a couple different things. It doesn't seem to be super clear. So Macbeth takes the throne, and then eventually is killed by Duncan's son. Okay, so it gives him the characters. Huh?
Kill him? Did you let the son kill him? Or did
I
No.
Not a clue. We just know that he eventually is. So not only does this give us the characters of Macbeth and Duncan, but it also links to King James, because Macbeth's BFF is Banquo, who is linked through the Stuart dynasty. Okay, so here's our original Macbeth, our real dude. So yes, there's lots of intrigue, politics, dirty dealings, all kinds of stuff going on in 11th century Scotland. The real Macbeth was born in 1005. He was the son of a ruling family. So could have been Thanes, could have been, either way we know that they were highly thought of. All right? Macbeth's father was murdered by his cousin. Okay? Part of the reason we include that is, well, one, because we have the information on it. Two, because it reinforces that idea of all the politics and intrigue and dirty dealings. Right? Macbeth married the granddaughter of the High King of Scotland. So that would have been like the king over all, which I'm not going to try to say it because it's going to sound like Grouch. He ruled for 17 years. Yeah.
Wasn't King James's mother, you said, was
Killed by
put to
Elizabeth.
death by
Queen Elizabeth?
So that also kind of ties us that instead of the father, it was the mother and sentenced to death instead of murdered
Perhaps.
by their cousins.
Mm-hmm. So he rules for 17 years. This is a long time. This is a long time at this time period. I believe, I don't know if I mentioned to you, so he brings a lot of peace and stability. In fact, so much peace and stability that he's able to leave and go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which would have taken him a year or more, right? And nobody took over while he was gone. I know. You usually can't do that. You can't like go somewhere and have your country still maintain intact, be intact and maintain authority when you get back.
That's really impossible for the youngest.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's why that information is there, is because it's impressive, right? And just not something that happened in that day. He also united northern and southern Scotland, and he was definitely the people's choice. He was a good king. He was well loved. Duncan, before him, not so much. From the accounts that we have, Duncan was not a good king. And he didn't rule for very long either. I want to say 5 years or less, right? So it just wasn't a big deal. So the takeaway, the real Macbeth,
Was dope.
yeah, was a good king. He was a good king. Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it's written.
How old was it?
People did not live very long at this time, though. Usually
Probably like 20,
40, so, you know.
Well, they put in his mark in the war, so it's good to see.
Mm-hmm. All right, you got it? The next slide's just kind of a repeat, like a key takeaways here. So you don't have to write this. It's just kind of the big picture. So overall, the big idea, Shakespeare modeled his play after an actual historical figure. Some of the plot points are the same. This figure is tied to the actual King James, right? So that's kind of an interesting twist. But the real Macbeth was almost universally loved and respected. Shakespeare's Macbeth was not. Shakespeare's Macbeth was not. All right, so is this Macbeth for King James? You remember that Banquo dude I mentioned?
Yeah.
Okay, so an elaborate family tree in Hollinshead's Chronicles suggests that King James is a descendant from him, right? Which, remember that bit I told you where King James was on his way to somewhere, I forget where now, and he's greeted by 3 witches who hail him as a descendant of Banquo? Yeah, okay, so Shakespeare's playing with that. He's keeping these things kind of involved. I know the first play, they got in trouble for using a little too much of his life. Instead, they're using like references to history here, family history. Let's see, according to Hollinshead's version of events, Banquo actually helps Macbeth to kill Duncan. Shakespeare neatly alters this so that Banquo is the hero in the play. Okay, so in the original, he's associated with Macbeth. But you remember that bit where I told you Shakespeare's Macbeth is not universally loved? We don't want to keep the king's ancestor tied to the bad guy, right? So he's got to pull those guys apart. He's got to disconnect them so that it doesn't throw shade at King James, right? So Shakespeare portrays Banquo as a worthy man so that it flatters the king. Yeah, okay. I don't really need to do that. Interestingly, even though he's in Hollinshead's Chronicles, there's no existence that Banquo actually ever existed. So they're not entirely sure. There is this family tree and all that kind of stuff, but there's no other evidence. So it's kind of an interesting little bit. Mm-hmm. All right. How many minutes? Okay. All right. So the king's healing powers. This is kind of fascinating. So Edward the Confessor is king of England at the same time that Macbeth rules Scotland. This is the guy that kind of starts the idea that of divine right. Like this is really becoming a bit more of a solid idea in some places, particularly in England. Not necessarily everywhere, but in England, they're like, okay, the king, chosen by God. So who can take a king off his throne? Not man. That's not man's job. And in order, like one of the signs that you were actually the king chosen by God was that you had healing powers. Edward the Confessor is the one who that kind of traces back to. He's the one that they think established this. Okay, so it was said that Edward the Confessor had healing powers and could cure diseases like scrofulous by laying his hands on people. Well, James too believed that he could do that. Not that anybody was really overly anxious to go out and touch the commoners, the unwashed masses, right? So it's not like they're going out and testing this. Okay, but he really liked this idea, so suggested that he had it too. It strengthens his royal lineage, right? It makes him like, oh, hey, if I have healing powers, then I must be the right king, the king chosen by God. Okay, so there you go. I think I said all those things, right? Yeah. Don't worry, it'll be in Google Classroom later. And you don't need this one. This one just kind of recaps. So sounds kind of like an insecure dude, right? But let's be fair. So some people really do are like, dude, King James, paranoid, insecure, all this kind of stuff. But if we take into account his father being assassinated, his mother killed under another queen's decree, ironically the same one who left him the throne of England. Interesting. And there have been at least 2 assassination attempts on his life. Not to mention these witches that have said that they have tried to prevent him from becoming king, right? So maybe he's got a little bit of a right to be paranoid.
To be honest, in his position, everyone is gonna be in the same way.
So this idea of being the rightful king is meant to kind of establish stability, right? Not this like, hey, you can be tossed asunder by any moving storm. Okay, so Demonology wasn't the only book he published, right? So that one is focusing on the spiritual stuff, right? The Basilican Doran is a book that he wrote about how a king should behave. These are the things appropriate, the behaviors, the tastes, the attitudes that is becoming of a king. They call them king becoming graces. And it's stuff like honesty and integrity and courage, right? Like all of your, if you think of, your code of chivalry kind of stuff, there's a lot of that in here. Not that there's a whole lot of books written by kings about how kings should behave, guys, so that is kind of interesting. But he definitely has this list of like, this is how you behave. Now, you better believe Shakespeare made use of this. It's absolutely in Macbeth, right? So if he wants to kind of nod to King James, he's going to associate these king becoming graces with the good leaders, the good kings. The opposite is going to be done for those who are the bad leaders, the bad kings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So demonstrating through the play, like, hey, I read your book, and also suggesting that he's right. Oh, look, it just happens to play out that way on stage, too. Amazing. All right, so tomorrow we'll pick up with Shakespeare's life and times. We should be able to finish by tomorrow. And
How many slides off?